face of a 5'2" reporter and forcibly kissing her with his bloody mouth is sexual harassment. I would like to see if he would think differently if a large bloody man did the same to him without his consent. Mr. Aram, in your interview, you say, "It's now a crazy world and people are no longer allowed to live." I hate the opinion that just because Pulav was so excited after his win warrants him to harass me in any form. This is crazy to me. I should be allowed to choose who can kiss me. This behavior has been happening for decades, and there are people that are getting away with this because women think they do not have a voice or because they don't have people supporting them. But what happened here with Pulav's suspension is speaking out for every woman that didn't have a place to say something. This is the change we need to see, and I hope this commission will continue to impose sanctions on athletes that are guilty of harassment at the workplace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we came here today to San Diego to commend the California Athletic Commission, CAC, for taking quick and appropriate action to suspend the boxing license of boxer Kubrat Pulev until he could prove to the CAC that he has completed an approved sexual harassment course, and he could show to the CAC today at this meeting that he's rehabilitated. The CAC suspended Mr. Pulev after a video of Mr. Pulev went viral, more than 1 million views, clearly showing him grabbing the face of and kissing on the lips Jenny Ravelow, a reporter, as she was interviewing him in a post-fight interview. At the last meeting of this athletic commission, the commission members clearly warned Mr. Pulev that he was not to engage in, quote, slut-shaming, end quote, of Ms. Ravelow. While Mr. Pulev himself appears not to have made public derogatory statements about Ms. Ravelow since the last California Athletic Commission meeting, his employer and promoter, Bob Aram of Top Rank, who I believe as a matter of law is also Mr. Pulev's agent and representative, has done what Mr. Pulev was warned not to do. In an interview on IFL TV posted on YouTube on June 15, 2019, Mr. Aram made blatantly false statements about Ms. Ravelow, stating that Ms. Ravelow, quote, was fooling around, end quote, with Mr. Pulev, while Mr. Pulev was in training months before the fight in question, and that Ms. Ravelow was acting as Mr. Pulev's, quote, semi-girlfriend before the fight, end quote. Both Mr. Pulev and Ms. Ravelow both testified before the commission on May 14th of this year that they first met each other at the weigh-in the day prior to the fight. Mr. Aram's totally unfounded and false statements that Ms. Ravelow was hanging around Mr. Pulev as he was training for the fight and that she was his, quote, semi-girlfriend, end quote, demonstrates that both he and it appears that his fighter, Mr. Pulev, have consciously decided to ignore and dismiss the Commission's admonitions made to Mr. Pulev on May 14, 2019, to stop shaming Ms. Ravelow. Not only did Mr. Aram make false and slanderous representations about Ms. Ravelow during the aforementioned interview, he belittled and criticized the Commission for requiring Mr. Pulev to attend a sexual harassment course as a condition of lifting his current boxing license suspension. Mr. Aram stated that it was, quote, crazy that he, Pulev, has to take a course on sexual harassment, end quote. Quote, he, meaning Pulev, did nothing wrong, end quote. It seems clear to me that neither Mr. Pulev nor Mr. Aram accepts any real responsibility for Mr. Pulev's reprehensible conduct, battery, and sexual harassment of Ms. Ravelow while she was conducting her interview of him on March 22, 2019, and the subsequent retaliation against her by attempting to slut-shame Ms. Ravelow for having exposed Mr. Pulev's sexual harassment of her. Mr. Aram's attack on the Commission for requiring Mr. Pulev to take a sexual harassment class and his referring to the Commission's order as, quote, outrageous, end quote, crazy, end quote, demonstrates that not only Mr. Aram and Mr. Pulev's complete lack of remorse, but in addition, also evidences their lack of basic understanding of conduct that is deemed inappropriate pursuant to Business and Professional Code 18602, as well as CCR Section 390, and their apparent contempt for the Commission's order. For example, here's some additional quotes from Mr. Aram's interview, and I apologize for the language, it's his, not mine. Quote, "I'm very sympathetic to sexual harassment charges if it's real sexual harassment, not bullshit," end quote. Quote, "I know what sexual harassment is, I really do, but that wasn't sexual harassment," end quote. Quote, "And I'm sure I'll get in trouble when this goes out. That's the way of the world, and I don't give a shit," end quote. I brought Mr. Aram's statements and video interview to the attention of the California Athletic Commission in a letter that I sent to Mr. Foster, the executive officer of this commission, on June 19th, 2019. Mr. Aram is also licensed by the California Athletic Commission, and I believe that his statements in his interview violate California Code of Regulations Section 390, which states that any licensee who conducts himself at any time or place in a manner which is deemed by the Commission to reflect discredit to boxing may have his or her license revoked or may be fined, suspended, or otherwise disciplined in such manner that the Commission may direct, end quote. I believe that Mr. Aram's statement in support of or on behalf of Mr. Pulev, criticizing the decision of the California Athletic Commission regarding Mr. Pulev, and Mr. Aram's utterance of false statements about Ms. Ravelo do reflect discredit to boxing, and that both Mr. Aram and Mr. Pulev should be sanctioned and disciplined by the CAC for Mr. Aram's statements. Apparently, the suspension of Mr. Pulev was not a teaching moment for Mr. Pulev and Mr. Aram. I'm disappointed that the California Athletic Commission did not place Mr. Aram's outrageous and false statements on today's agenda, and that the Commission did not decide to discipline Mr. Aram and Mr. Pulev for Mr. Aram's statements, which have brought discredit to boxing and to the CAC. And we're happy to answer any questions. I might add that I'm glad that they have now or are going to put on their website a sexual harassment policy. Having said that, I have also just stated to the need to monitor Mr. Aram 24/7, because I sent them a copy of his interview on video in June for them to view, and I think they properly should have invited him or asked him to, requested him to attend this meeting today and explain himself. He is the employer of Kubrat Pulev. He is the representative of Kubrat Pulev. He speaks as the agent for, as a matter of law, Mr. Pulev. He should be held responsible and have to explain what he did. The fact that he participated in a class, Mr. Aram I'm talking about, doesn't mean that he's benefited from the class. Where's the evidence that he benefited from the class? He's not here. Just because he went doesn't mean he benefited from it. I've represented many victims of sexual harassment where someone was given a sexual harassment class and then repeats the sexual harassment. So I think the best evidence of Mr. Aram's feelings are what he says on that video, which I provided to all of you. And I don't think we should make a leap and suggest that, okay, well, he's benefited because he sat there. How do we know that? Why isn't he here?
Ms. Albright, what's the gender makeup of the commission? Are they all men? And also, is this the first case of its kind before the commission in which they have actually taken some sort of disciplinary action in allegations involving sexual assault?
Thank you for those questions. There are two women that I see on the commission today. That's good. They were positive and they were active in reference to this issue. I do believe that this is the first time that the California Athletic Commission has, at least publicly, aired a discussion of and had a hearing to examine an allegation of sexual harassment by a boxer and then taken action to suspend and continue the suspension of the alleged wrongdoer, licensee boxer, by requiring him to at least take a class, and until he could prove that he had taken the approved sexual harassment class, he would continue to be suspended. I think Mr. Pulev certainly has paid a price for this because he was not able to fight in June. He therefore lost a big purse that he might have been able to obtain had he been able to do his big fight in June. So he literally has paid a price for this. But we'll see. The best evidence of whether they have benefited from all of this is what Mr. Pulev says and does in the future, not just about female reporters, but also about any woman in his life who comes in contact with him. And we'll have to see whether Mr. Aram decides to repeat his statements in the future. He said, oh, I think I'm going to get in trouble for this. Well, he's certainly in trouble with me. And I will be watching Mr. Aram's statements in the future very carefully. He can exercise his free speech, and there may be consequences depending on what he says, what he does.
Was it the commission that used the term slut?
So I think this was a precedent, and I am very proud of Jenny because without her courage, I don't know that there would have been a sexual harassment policy that has been proposed today, and I don't think that Mr. Pulev would ever have had to take a sexual harassment class and also face the public scrutiny that he's faced on account of what he did to Ms. Ravelo.
Would we file a lawsuit on this?
I saw a report. We have never stated that we're filing a lawsuit. We have no plans to file a lawsuit. We did not file a police report, but we certainly have brought his misconduct, Mr. Pulev's and Mr. Aram's, what I call misconduct statements, to the attention of the commission, which has taken action as a result.
So there's no lawsuit in the future that's planned?
There's nothing planned.
This wasn't about money?
This was never about money. This was about having it as a teaching moment. And we'll have to see how much both of them have learned from this. The child who says, I'm sorry, I got caught. I put my hand in the cookie jar after he gets caught and seen doing it. We'll have to see whether that conduct is ever repeated. But this is very serious. In California, we take, sexual harassment, violence against women very seriously. We are, I think, leaders in the nation on this. And so I think that Mr. Pulev now knows that whatever he does is going to be subject to public scrutiny. It's going to be taken seriously.
So his license, I'm sorry, I missed the top of this news conference, the license is reinstated as of today?
I don't know if it's as of today. They said it's reinstated. You would need to check with the commission as of which day that is, would take effect. So that's it.
And the origin of this phrase, slut shaming,
That was actually used by one of the commission members
yeah, I have,
last time.
I think it's a problematic term.
Well, I have issues with it as well, but it was used, so therefore I'm using it. And also Mr. Aram used it in his interview. And so I'm essentially reporting what he said. Obviously, Ms. Ravelo is a professional reporter, and, you know, that's what she is.
Right,
That's what she does. That's what she does.
You can see why some people might have problems with
I
the
do,
term.
I do. But the commission member used it at at the last hearing, and then Mr. Aram repeated it in his interview. So therefore, I'm reporting what they said.
Sure.
Okay.
Mr. Rallo, has Mr. Poulet apologized to you personally?
No, he hasn't.
I think he did at the last hearing when he was sitting there before the cameras. But between the time that he battered Ms. Ravelo by grabbing her and kissing her on the lips, and until such time as there was a hearing, which was sometime later, he never contacted me to ask if he could personally meet with Ms. Ravelo to apologize to her. He did not do that. Why he did not do that, only he can explain. He had the opportunity, only did it when he was seeking to have his license reinstated at the last commission meeting in Los Angeles in May. Glad he did it. Does that undo the harm? No. Doesn't undo the harm from his grabbing her and kissing her, and it doesn't undo the harm about the false statements he made on the internet about her after, when he was trying to justify his misconduct toward Ms. Ravelo. And now we have continued retaliation against her by Mr. Aram by making false statements about her.
The commission declined to take action on those statements. Have you asked them formally to do that ahead of today, or do you plan to?
In reference to Mr. Aram's statements? Absolutely. I sent a letter, which I provided to the press, and I'd be happy to email you, in June, in plenty of time, to place this on the agenda. More than 30 days, asking them to put this on the agenda for today. They failed to put Mr. Aram's statements on the agenda, nor, apparently, did they request that he appear today to explain his statements about Mr. Poulet and Ms. Ravelo, which they could have done. My sense is they wanted to finish with this and move on. Okay, well, it's hard to move on when Mr. Aram, who is an extremely well-known boxing promoter, who represents a lot of top boxers, is not here to explain himself. Perhaps because he can't explain himself or won't explain himself. I don't know. Maybe there's another reason. But he hasn't, and he has not apologized for his statements. And here's my question. How is this a teaching moment for his other boxers when Mr. Aram, who was also their promoter of a lot of well-known, famous or infamous, depending on who he might be representing, boxers, who are they going to listen to? They're going to listen probably to their promoter, their employer, who thinks that grabbing a woman and kissing her on the lips in the middle of an interview is not sexual harassment.
Can I ask, Ms. Ravelo, do you feel that as a consequence of this incident, your career has been affected adversely or maybe even you've gotten more support?
Well, obviously, Top Rank won't allow me to cover their events, and I think some boxers kind of try to stay away with me for the interviews. And I do articles, and I'm just not really going to the events as much.
So it has happened.
It has, yes.
Okay. All right, anything else? Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
And if you just email me, I'll have you send you a copy of my statement, I'll send a letter. And I'll know where my statements are. Oh, okay. All right.
Just to come along.
I'm sorry.